Hi there, it's Reed from Blueberry Quilts. How'd you like to make the Riding the Waves quilt with me? It's made with QT's Pacifica line, so stay tuned and we'll make this quilt together. In order to make the Riding the Waves quilt, we're going to need some supplies. And of course we're going to need the pattern from Blueberry Quilts. And as you can see, this makes a 58 by 58 inch quilt. You're going to need some beautiful fabric. This happens to be the Pacifica, like the Pacific Ocean line from QT Fabrics. And it has all these fun sea creatures on it. And in the panel, there's something like 20 different sea creatures. So there's all these beautiful sea creatures to pick from. And I'll be cutting out some of these to put in the quilt. Then there's only a couple other fabrics that are needed for this quilt. There's this beautiful teal swirl. There's this nice tan shell toss. Look at those gorgeous shells throughout that tan fabric. Then there's these cute little sea turtles on kind of a mustardy yellow background. And then there's all these fun sea creatures on a navy background. So those are the 4 additional fabrics, and then the panel fabric that's necessary to make this quilt. You're also going to need fabric for backing, which I have chosen this one. And you'll need fabric for binding, which I've chosen that one. You'll need a couple other tools. Of course, you're going to need a rotary cutter. You'll need a straight edge ruler. You'll need a square up ruler, because when we cut out the panel pieces, we're going to want to square them up to 8.5 inches. And you're going to need some pins, of course. And this is optional, but this will really make your life much, much easier. You would think that sewing split rectangles would be as easy as sewing half square triangles, but it really is quite a bit more difficult. And although the pattern gives you the instructions for sewing these together without using the special ruler, trust me, if you get this ruler, your life will be made so much easier. And it is the ruler that I'm going to be using throughout this video to demonstrate how to make the split rectangles. So that's pretty much the supplies that are needed, except for a sewing machine and some thread. So let's get started. Now, to cut the panel pieces out of the panel fabric, the first thing you want to check is make sure that your motifs, or these fish pictures, are basically square within the fabric. Sometimes when the fabric is wound on a bolt, it kind of gets askew and it may not be straight. And if you find that's the case, that you don't basically have, like, straight lines going along these edges, you may have to block the panel, which would basically be spraying it with water and then ironing it and kind of pinning it in place so that it will dry fairly straight. Then the next thing that I did was I wanted to have one edge that would be my first marking, and the pattern says that in order to get 8.5 inch squares, which is what you need here, that you need to have like 3/8 of an inch from the edge of this picture. And so what I did was laid a ruler on there and measured about 3/8 and cut one of these along there so that they were basically at the 3/8 inch mark away from the edge of the picture. So that gives me one straight edge to work with. Then the next thing I do is I use a square up ruler, and I'm going to start with this octopus right here. And I know that this is approximately 3/8 of an inch here, And you can probably tell that my piece wasn't totally straight, because here this is like 3/8 of an inch, and as we get up here this is beginning to look more like a 1/2 inch. So it's hard to be exact when you're working with panels, and so you try to get it as close as you can. And we're probably going to have maybe a little bit more of this blue showing in some places than we will in others when we put the blocks together. But I don't think it's going to detract from the overall quilt when it's completed. So we know that this is our first edge. We're going to put the square up ruler on there, and then we're going to look to make sure that at the top of this we're basically going up 3/8 of an inch. And then we're going to make sure that down here at the bottom we also will have 3/8 of an inch. So there's the 1/8. 1, 2, 3 would be about there. And that's going to make that one pretty big. So an 8.5 is there. So we're going to go like this. There's 8.5. 1, 2, 3. So that's about 3/8 there. And then at the top, it's not quite 3/8. So we're going to put it right about there. And then line this left edge. I'm left-handed, so for you right-handed people, you would do this the exact opposite. And then I'm going to take and trim this top here. Okay. Now once I've done that, I now have two straight edges, this and this. So I'm going to flip it 180 degrees and put it like this. And then now I can take and put my 1 inch and 1 inch in the upper left-hand corner. If you're right-handed, you're going to put it in the right-hand corner. And I'm going to look for the 8.5 inch line, and I'm going to put it along this straight edge. And I'm going to look for the 8.5 inch down here at the bottom, and I'm going to put it on this bottom edge. And I'm going to, it's perfectly square at this point, so I'm going to line up the 8.5 inch line with this straight edge, and the 8.5 on the bottom with this straight edge. And then I'm going to cut off the remaining two sides, which will give me an 8.5 inch square that when it's put into the block is going to square up at 8 inches. And I think I need to use my new mats. Okay, so there it is. And you'll notice that in some places there appears to be a little bit more blue, a little bit less. So it's really hard on a panel piece to get it perfect. And even if we were to try to get it to totally enclose within here, these pieces may not be an exact size either. So you just have to eyeball it and do the best that you can. So here's the next one. We know that this side over here is the side that we trimmed. And so we're going to look to see that we get at least 3/8 of an inch above that top. And we're going to look down here on the bottom to see where our half is, and if that's going to give us, and that looks like that gives us 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to move this over here like this, along that edge that we previously cut. I'm going to check to see how much is sticking out. So see here, it looks like there's more than 3/8. Here there's more like 2/8. And that's just going to have to be the way it is, because this particular piece of fabric was not, the pictures are not printed straight on there. Well, I guess they're printed straight on there, but when they're rolled on the bolt, they get misshapen. And I'm definitely having trouble cutting this. Okay, so now we have the two edges. We're going to turn it 180 degrees. And once again, we're going to take and line up the 8.5 inch over here and the 8.5 inch on the bottom. So there's my 8.5 inch on the right-hand side. Here is my 8.5 inch on the bottom. Line up both of those straight edges with the 8.5 inch lines. And then we're going to trim these final two sides. And there we go. So that's how you cut your panel pieces apart so that you get an 8.5 inch square. And here you can see this one's pretty even around, but it looks like it's a little bit smaller there and a little bit smaller there. And that just shows you that the bolt kind of skewed the pictures when the fabric was put on the bolt. And I didn't actually block this fabric ahead of time, so if I had, that probably would have made these turn out a little bit more even. This beautiful teal fabric needs to be cut into 4.5 inch strips, which I've done. And then it also needs to be cut into 8 2.5 inch strips. And so I've brought out my Stripology ruler, Stripology squared ruler, in order to do that. It makes cutting out 2.5 inch strips super easy. So there are squares and stars on the bottom of this ruler, and the square markings are 2.5 inch. So when you move over to the next square, it's the next 2.5 inch strip. And there are lines up here at the top that you can line up, and lines at the bottom that you can line up. And you just make sure that your rotary cutter goes extra deep, and you put it in the groove, and you slide along like that. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4. My ruler slid a little bit on that one. And last but not least, 5. And so you'll see how easy I got 5 2.5 inch strips using the Stripology ruler. And I need 3 more, so I'm going to slide this over and put it basically straight on the line there, a little bit over the line there. Take this and put it so that the first square is the part that's going to get trimmed off, and then make sure these line up at the top up here, and these lines line up down here on the bottom. And it is necessary to have a firm grip on the ruler so that it doesn't slide around on you. So there's 1, 2, and 3. And so that's how easy it was to get the 8 2.5 inch strips that I need out of this beautiful teal fabric. So the next thing we do is we subcut the larger strips into squares, and we're going to subcut these strips into rectangles. So I'm going to trim up this end over here. And then I'm going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4.5, which will create the rectangle. And I'm going to go over another 4.5. And I'm going to do that to all 8 of those strips. So now I am cutting the half rectangles, and using the Split Rec tool from Studio 180 in order to do it. So the first thing you have to do is look to see what size strips you need. And so for a 2x4 finished unit, which is what our half rectangles are going to be, it says to cut strips 5 inches. So this is a 5-inch strip. The first cut that you make is to line up this black line along the bottom cut line, and then this, where it says 2x4 finished unit, along the right edge. I am left-handed, so I'm doing this left-handed, so if you were doing it right-handed, it would be the reverse, and actually I think you would put the fabric horizontal. But the instructions that come with the ruler tell you how to do it for left and right-handed people. So I'm going to line up that line along the bottom, and this black line along the right-hand side, and then I'm going to make this cut. And then what we do is we take the ruler and we flip it 180 degrees. There's a second trim line there that goes along this right edge, and a second trim line diagonal that goes along that bottom angled cut. So that dark line goes along the right edge. This line goes along that bottom cut edge, like that. And after a while you'll get used to seeing a certain amount of fabric beyond that line right there, and you'll just get used to that and know that you've got things lined up correctly. So when that's in place, you cut, and it makes a nice straight cut. Then we're going to take and rotate the ruler 180 degrees again, and once again line up the 2x4 finished on the right hand side and this solid black line along the bottom, and then this edge is flush with the left edge. And when we get that in place, we cut along the diagonal. And I move it up just a little bit to make sure that I actually have a cut before moving my ruler out of place. Then I'm going to flip the ruler 180 degrees again, put this second trim line along that right edge, put the diagonal line along the bottom. And again, you'll notice I have a little bit beyond that 5.5 inch line, and I cut, make a straight cut. So that is how you cut out these mirror image pieces. That's the other thing, is that when you do this, we're creating mirror images. So we're putting the fabrics, or these strips that we cut, wrong sides together, and they also can be put right sides together. And I think you even could put your two strips together and do it. So in other words, I'm going to be doing the exact same thing with this navy fabric. I'm going to be cutting out the same type of rectangles, and they're going to be mirror image just like this. So you probably could take a strip of this, a strip of that, and put the fabrics right side together or wrong side together and cut them out that way as well. I just think this is easier when your strips are already cut and have wrong sides facing. It just makes it easier to do. So I'm going to continue cutting these with the Split Rects tool from Studio 180, and then I will do it with the navy fabric as well, and then I will show you how these units get sewn together. So when you have your half rectangles all cut out, this is what it looks like with the mirror images. You have a navy on the outside here, a navy on the outside here, a light tan on the inside, and another light tan on the inside. And so notice the angles going that direction on these and this direction on these. So the next thing you do is you flip them on top of each other, and basically you want to have a little bit of this point, a tiny little point there, and then there, a tiny little point. So you want a tiny little point sticking out on both ends. So this is what the one on this side looks like as you sew it together. And this is what it looks like on this side. And again, you have a tiny little speck of tiny little point sticking out on both ends. That's how you put them together. You're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam along here, and you're going to press to the dark, and you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam along here, and you're going to press to the dark. So I will go sew those up and then show you what they look like when they're pressed. So here the half rectangle blocks are when they've been sewn together. You can see that it's stitched along there. And in order to make the block, you need 2 where the dark is on the left-hand side and 2 where the dark is on the right-hand side. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to trim these up with the split rectangle ruler. So after we have the split rectangles sewn in pairs where they're mirror images of each other, they need to be trimmed up. These have already been trimmed, and when they're trimmed you can see that there isn't a perfect point. There's a little bit of a space there, and same thing on the other end, there's a little bit of a space there. You can see it here, the triangle or the line of the angle doesn't go right to the corner. There's like a little space on both ends, and that's what you want because that figures into the 1/4 inch and making those seams match up. So the next thing we have to do is on a pair that are not trimmed up, we're going to trim them up. And we're going to use the same ruler, but this time we're going to use this little section that has rectangles on it with diagonal lines. So we're looking for the 2.5 by 4.5. Well, actually we want 2 by 4 finished. So we're looking for this line right here that's 2 by 4 finished. And we're going to put that line, or this line, on this one we're going to put the line this way. And we're going to take this diagonal line and we're going to line it up with the diagonal line on the little unit. And then we're going to look for the 2.5 inch, which is right here, and we're going to make sure that we still have fabric sticking out there. And we're looking for the 4.5 inch line, which is down here, and we want to make sure there's fabric sticking out below that. And when that is the case, we can trim up 2 of these sides. So we're going to trim here, and we're going to trim here. Then we're going to take and flip this 180 degrees. And again, we're going to put this diagonal line on there. The only difference is this time, we're going to take this 4.5 inch line and this 2.5 inch line, and we're going to put those on the cut lines. So we line up that intersection right there, and we make sure that it's lined up with the bottom, and that it's lined up with this edge over on the right. Get it perfectly lined up there. And make sure that our diagonal line again is running with the seam line. That's important too. There we go, that looks pretty good. And then we're going to trim up these other 2 sides. So there's one of them trimmed up, and now we'll trim up the other one. And again, we're looking for that 2 by 4 finished line, and we're lining that up with the seam line, the diagonal seam line. We're looking to make sure that there's fabric sticking out beyond 2.5 inches and fabric sticking out below the 4.5 inches. Maybe you can't see that. Putting the 2 by 4 diagonal line along the diagonal seam line, and then we're making sure that the 2.5 has fabric sticking out here and the 4.5 has fabric sticking out there. Now I'm going to move it down a little closer for me to actually do the cutting. So again, I'm lining up those lines. And that looks pretty good. So we're going to trim this left side and trim along the top here. And then we're going to take and rotate it 180 degrees and put this diagonal line on the diagonal seam line. And now our 2.5 inch line goes right along this right edge, and the 4.5 goes along the bottom. And then this little corner lines up. I'll move it up so you can see it. This little corner right here, where the 4.5 and the 2.5 intersect, goes right on that corner of the block like that. So those corners line up. Now I'm going to move it again so I can cut it. And I'm going to get that corner lined up, get the diagonal line lined up on the block, make sure the 2.5 is on the right edge and the 4.5 is on the bottom. And we're going to cut along here and cut along the top here. So there we go, we have those two cut out. So that's all the scraps we have. So not much waste, and we end up with perfectly trimmed blocks that have these little extra sections here. So we have those two making a mirrored image, and then you need 2 pairs for each block. So there we have 2 pairs of perfectly trimmed up blocks. Now the next thing that happens is there are rectangles that go next to them. So we're going to line these up like this, where those two are the same and these two are the same. And then a rectangle goes here, a rectangle goes here, and on this one, up here, a rectangle goes here. So that's those two, and then we have these two, and rectangles on these go on the outside, so it goes like that and that. And we flip it over and sew along that edge a 1/4 inch. And we do that on all 4 of these. So when we've done that, we end up with something that looks like this. And you can see that there's a little bit of selvage up here, but that doesn't really matter because it's going to be within its, this amount of selvage is less than a 1/4 inch, so it's going to be taken up in the 1/4 inch, so I'm not worried about that. But they get sewn together like that. And so you need all 4 of these for a block. Then the next thing that happens is we take our panel pieces, and this time we have a little fish like that, and we sew these two together. So 2 of those are sewn together, and 2 of these are sewn together. I think this actually goes this way, yep, like that. So you have kind of this navy wedge showing. You have this navy wedge showing, and you also kind of have a tan wedge showing, and there is a teal square that goes there. So then this gets flipped and sewn onto that, and this gets flipped and sewn onto that. When we've done that, we get a piece that looks like this, and a piece that looks like this. Now some of you may be saying, that crab looks like he's upside down. We still have the navy wedge going that way and the tan wedge going that way, but he's upside down. And you're right, he is. So here is a completed block. This one is of the starfish, and he looks just like the fish that I just showed you. Because see, here the fish is right side up, and that goes there, and this goes here, and that goes there. So the fish and the starfish are done the same way. But 50% of the blocks have to be turned a different direction. And if I look at the pattern, I believe it tells which way. I need to find it in here. Yes, 50% of them are upside down. So 50% are going to be right side up like this, and 50% are going to be upside down like that. And the reason for that is because of how the blocks are rotated in the quilt in order to get this wavy design. So that's why 50%. So they're all made this exact same way with all the pieces in the exact same arrangement, but 50% of the sea creatures from the panel are upside down when you construct the block this way. And the reason why is because of how the blocks get rotated to create the pattern in the quilt. And so the way you can tell is if you want your creatures to be in the exact same positions that mine are in, you just look for the sea creature and then rotate it and see which direction it is if it's upside down. So basically this is right side up, upside down, right side up, upside down. This one's upside down, right side up, upside down, right side up. So they basically alternate every other block. And that makes it easy so you can sew all the blocks together the same way, but you just have to remember that 50% of them, the sea creatures, are upside down. So I'm going to keep sewing these blocks together, and then I'll show you how we lay out the quilt and get that wavy pattern in it. Okay, I have all of the blocks sewn and laid out. You can see they go across like that, and they create these patterns throughout. See how there's like a dark pattern going that direction, and then in between here there's like that light blue with white, and you'll see that more as I actually get the blocks sewn together. But I lay them all out like this and make sure that it looks good and that I like the placement of all the blocks. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is how all the blocks are basically the same, but they're these pieces are rotated. So this one is one of the rotated ones. So see how the fish is now upside down in this one, and it's right side up in that one. And basically the blocks are constructed exactly the same way. So we'll move to the next one, which is another one that was constructed with just the octopus piece being upside down. So he's upside down, but you can see that the rest of the block is constructed exactly the same as this one where the fish was right side up. So basically every other one goes upside down, right side up, upside down, right side up, and all the blocks are exactly the same. So also these blocks together in rows like this, and then also the rows together from bottom to top, and I'll press towards the top. And as I'm sewing the blocks together in rows, I will press every other direction. So that top row, I'll press everything to the right. And then as I sew the second row, I'll press everything to the left. And then the third row, I'll press everything to the right. And the fourth row, I'll press everything to the left again. So it'll go left, right, left, right. And as soon as I've done that and I'm ready to put the borders on, I'll be back and show you how I put the borders on. So now I'm sewing the borders on the Riding the Waves quilt, and I want to show you how I do it to achieve the best results. So I already have the inner border sewn on. You can see it's a dark navy, and it's done with making the strips mitered, which basically means they're put together at 45-degree angles. And the reason I do that is because when you have a 45-degree line as opposed to a straight line, it basically makes the fabrics join up better, and it's not as obvious that it's been pieced. So that's the main reason for mitering those strips. And I do that on both the smaller inner border and the larger outer border. I'll have to make another video sometime to show how I do those mitered strips for borders, and it's basically the same technique as joining the strips together for binding. So now I'm sewing the larger outer border on. And before putting either one of these borders on, it's really important to measure the quilt. And so this is a side here, and so basically I measure up, one side of the quilt, then I come over and I measure in the middle of the quilt, and then I come over on the far end and measure on the far end. And you want to make sure that those measurements are the same as what the pattern says. So now for putting on this outer border, this larger outer border, the pattern says that the measurement of this piece on the sides should be 50.5. And so I measured it on both sides and in the middle, and each measurement was indeed 50.5, which means I had consistent 1/4 inch sewing as I was sewing all of the pieces together. And the reason you want to measure those sides and the middle before cutting your borders is that that's how you get your quilt to be square. So let's say that the far left edge had been 48 and the middle was 49 and the right side was 50. Basically, you would average those three measurements and say, okay, my border needs to be 49 because that's the midpoint of those three measurements. And so what happens is on the 48 side, you need to stretch it a little bit. So you need to stretch the fabric and on the, stretch the border a little bit to make it fit. And then on the right side, where the measurement was smaller, you need to stretch the actual quilt piece a little bit to fit the binding. And so that's called easing the pieces in. And that's why it's important to measure those three places. And by doing that, when you put the bindings on, your quilt should be square because you've taken an average of all the measurements. So another thing I do is I do pin the pieces together just because I find that that's easier than trying to keep them together as I'm sewing along. But if you're able to do it without pinning, that's fine. And then you'll notice that I have a 1/4 inch foot on my machine. And it has a right edge on it. You can see there's like a little black edge, and you ride the fabric right along that edge, right along that black edge, and that will give you a consistent 1/4 inch. The other thing I do is I don't actually look at the needle when I'm sewing. I look at the plate that's on my machine here, and there is a measurement up here that says 3/8, and the one next to it is 2/8. And so I look right here and make sure that my fabric is lining up right with that 2/8 inch marking, and that's what I'm focusing on. I don't look at the needle because if the fabric is consistently going past that 2/8 inch line, it will be fine when it gets to the needle. So that's how I work at getting consistent 1/4 inches in my piecing and when I'm adding my borders to the quilt. Thanks for joining me on making the Riding the Waves quilt with QT Fabrics Pacifica line. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you'll be notified when I post future videos. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.